Okay, folks, we're moving into the post-war era here. So World War II is done. We've dropped a couple of atomic bombs, one on Hiroshima, a little 12.5 kiloton device, another on Nagasaki, about a 20 kiloton, and the war's over. Okay, so at this particular point, we've now got us a new president. We know that FDR is going to die in the spring of 1945, and his new vice president, Harry S. Truman, is going to carry this forward. And Harry Truman, over the last few years, has gotten a bit of rehabilitation. When I was much younger, you would have thought Harry Truman couldn't have got elected dog catcher, but now we're seeing that this is a man of common sense and intelligence and just something a little unlike most politicians we get today. And I think that's a good thing. But as we move on, we need to look at the political spectrum for just a minute. We're coming back to the 20s. We kind of had this, we went through the 20s and almost to the 1930s, and then we had the Great Depression and the Second World War. But we need to come back to this spectrum. And on the left, you've got our radicals. And on the right, you've got our reactionary elements, just like we always have. But as we move into the mid-late 40s, 50s, 60s, 70s, and beyond, we're going to start using words like liberal and conservative. And note where they are on the spectrum. And then my favorite thing, the center. Right here, little white circle in the middle. Now, you're going to see a couple of definitions pop up. Leave it on there for just a second so you can see those. But as you can see, radical is to the left of liberal. Reactionary is to the right of conservative. So don't think we're getting too far into those camps, but we're all going to be a little left and a little right of center. And so as we move along, looking at himself, check him out there. Got his little glasses on and his National Guard uniform. And the question I've always asked students over the years was how did Truman's background make him ideally suited for the presidency, and how did it handicap him? Well, let's look at the handicap part first. And I'm not sure it really is a handicap, but we're going to look at it that way anyhow. One of them is his education. The man was the last non-college educated president in America. He took a few night classes in a community college in Kansas City or a junior college in Kansas City, but he didn't have a degree, and he's the last one to do that. But I've often said that there are a lot of people educated beyond their intelligence. My my daddy used to make fun of me all the time for the degrees sitting on my wall, but that's okay. I think he was half kidding because he paid for one of them. But anyhow, but that background, he's a farmer's child, which means he's up early, he's working all day, yes sir, no sir, relatively strict family, a nice moral upbringing that he's going to actually catch a hold of the funding for the atomic bomb quite by accident when he's in the Senate, and basically uncovers it, and the military has to tell him to hush a little while. They're trying to keep it a secret, and so he's ideally suited because he is that guy. He does have a lot of stick-to-itiveness. He had started what they call a haberdashery. It's like a men's clothing store, and it had failed during that post-World War I era. And so not only has he experienced success in leading men in World War I, but he's experienced failure as well. And that experience in failure actually probably makes him a better leader. But here's a guy from out in the middle of Missouri or Missouri, depending on how you want to pronounce it, right there on the edge of Kansas, where he's part of the Pendergast political machine. And many times his opponents would say, there's the senator from Pendergast, which he always tried to shrug off and do things to basically get rid of that image, that stain of being part of a political machine. So Harry Truman is the right guy at the right time, even though by the end of his second term, people really don't see it that way, and that's sad. But like I said, the rehabilitation's happened here in the late 20th, early 21st century, and so anywho, we'll move along to his background for just a second. I love that picture right there. I mean, just check out this guy. You know that baby's going to be a mess when he grows up. So again, his father's a farmer. He grows up with that work ethic of a farmer. I'm not farming because that's hard work. I'm going to sit in this chair here at my desk at school. But he's got a problem, and you saw in the earlier slide, he's got these thick glasses on, and his eyesight is incredibly poor, and he couldn't participate in a whole lot of sports. So instead of participating in sports, he cultivated his mind, and he was an incredible reader. History was one of his subjects, and he had ancestors on both sides of the American Civil War, though he claimed most of them to be Confederates. And so it's one of those where he just loved it, and so he's going to learn from that because history gives us so many answers that it's not even funny. And so he does, instead of playing sports, he does join the National Guard as an artillery captain in World War One, and he had to lead men from all walks of life, from wealthy, dapper kind of guys all the way down to tobacco spitting illiterates. And he learned how to do it. Harry Truman could get people to do things that nobody else could. And that is going to be what makes him what makes him such a good leader, especially from our perspective today. So what about his background? Check out him driving a car here. That failed businessman, no college education, but he's very well read. I mean, I'm not real sure that a piece of paper on the wall does anything except give you the union card, so to speak. And again, he always had to fight that tarnish, which is what I'd said earlier. So he's got this very unique background. He gets pulled into the president's circle and onto the ticket because he's relatively conservative, or at least everybody thinks. And some things he is conservative, and others he's going to be quite liberal, as we just saw on that spectrum. And so he gets pulled into it because he's more conservative than Roosevelt's former vice president, and he needs somebody to kind of bring the South in. So this is a guy that can kind of bring the South in. So anyhow, that reputation as being tough and fair, that's going to serve him well. And president, as you can see him here taking an oath of office, this is actually his second oath of office. One of the questions I would always ask classes is, what are the challenges that face him? And they are untold how big they were. And I think as I've gotten older and have held a few positions where you're in charge of big organizations, you kind of say, yeah, an organization of 1,300 people, I cannot imagine having to put together the entire U.S. government. And when word came that FDR had died, Harry Truman went to see Eleanor Roosevelt and basically asked if there was anything he could do for her. And Eleanor, understanding the stress of the job, said, "No, Mr. President. Is there anything that we can do for you?" And so he's got to end the war. Then he's got to pull the Allies together in some form of post-war world. We have to, not only do you wage war, sometimes you must wage peace. And he's got to do that. And so those are the two things. Now you've let the genie out of the bottle or the toothpaste out of the tube with the atomic bomb, and we've got to deal with that mess. I mean, now you can level an entire city in one fell swoop. So we've got all of those things to deal with. Then we have to rebuild the world after the war. So, and then, that's not even to mention at home. At some point, those 14 million men are coming home or going back to different jobs than they've had. That leads to a lot of fear. And when they have a fear that the Great Depression had simply ended during the war, it stopped, kind of had a halftime, and it's coming back again. Okay? This should say World War II, not World War I. Again, sometimes, folks, I can't type. What you get are a lot of two-income families. You have businesses that have cost-plus contracts. And what that means is the government agrees to pay that company whatever something costs plus profit. That's an interesting thing. That's a moneymaker right there. Then there were all these bonds out there that people had paid money into, going to get much more money later. Well, that later has come. And so what happens is World War II ends the Depression, but we're afraid. Okay, we're afraid it's going to come back. Now that all this big brouhaha over the economy is done, we're churning out tens of billions of dollars worth of stuff a year, and now the government's going to put a stop to it. And that's what happens is people don't want it to happen. They won't put policies in place and agencies in place to mitigate it. We can't go back to where it was in the 30s. We can't go back to where it was if you read The Grapes of Wrath. We can't go back to the Jodes and the mess we were in. And the good thing is we don't. Because what you see here is jobs. And I apologize for the way it looks on the screen. It looks better on my screen here. Let's see if it does something fun. Oh, light turns light. Okay. So what happens is, in 1945, the employment rate is 99+%. I mean, it's truly full unemployment, but there's a problem. A lot of those jobs are held by women. My grandmother was one. My grandmother Patterson was one of them. She worked all over the place during the war. And, again, those 14 million men are come home. What are they going to do for a living? That's a problem that we had to figure out. How do we fix it? What people had not counted on was the pent-up demand. During the war, remember, you read you couldn't buy new cars, you couldn't buy tires, you couldn't buy gasoline, you couldn't buy pantyhose. Well, you could, but there were so few of these things that pent up demand, people want it, and they want it now. Instead of Ford making B-29 and B-24 bombers, man, they need to start making cars again. Okay, and if you saw the movie Ford versus Ferrari, there's a little bit of an allusion to that in the first of the film. Then what are we going to do for these soldiers, these GIs, government issues here? What are we going to do for them? I'm going to pass the GI Bill of Rights that still exists today. And when I was an undergrad back in the late 80s, early 90s, I went to school with several guys who had went into the military, in order to fund their education. I had several students who did that. And it's fantastic things, well deserved. But not only is it going to be college stuff, it's going to be, some unemployment insurance. It's going to be relatively inexpensive home loans. All of these things designed to create what they call warriors for the middle class, to move these former soldiers and sailors and airmen and whatever else into that middle class. This is unlike, can you imagine the laissez-faire guys at the turn of the 20th century? This right here it's like turning government on its head, but it's in such a good way. And also, since we have had the Depression and then during the war, there's almost this moral obligation to citizens to provide things for them. It's like, okay, you've been doing this for so long, we become dependent or become expectant. And during the Truman administration, the second one especially, there's a lot of talk among Republicans of how do we run these things back? How do we carve them out and get back to what they called fiscal responsibility? And Eisenhower, who's going to win in 52, is going to have a hard time with that because he wins as a Republican, but he is not an arch conservative. So we got some fun politics in this time. But during the war, you had a lot of things like shotgun marriages. I joke with my aunt that my grandfather Brown was what a shotgun marriage to my grandmother, and it wasn't, but I joke about it. And you see have a rise of illegitimacy and ladies getting pregnant. It's a different time. We don't think of that period of time, our grandparents or great grandparents, to some of you, in that mold. But guess what? It was there. And so there's going to be this huge rise in it. And people getting married and divorced that we're going to see in just a second. And in a lot of households, women become the breadwinners. We saw some of that in World War I. But in World War II, there is going to be a distinct change in what women think their role in the family is. And that's going to create some friction and some issues throughout the late 40s, 50s, 60s. It could be today. I mean, in the Brown house, if we don't both work, we're in trouble. But what you get with all that, with these marriages of not just of convenience, but of heightened emotion and wartime climate and whatnot, you get a divorce rate that spikes by the late 40s. So we've got a little different society going on during that time. Then there's the Taft-Hartley Act, which is going to be a massive blow to unions, and it's anti-New Deal. And it says, listen, before you can strike, you've got to have a cooling off period. And so we're not going to let you because Eugene Debs, again, the crazy socialist Eugene Debs that threatened to throw strikes on during the war. Can you imagine that? So that's one of those now where in the Taft-Hartley Act says, no, we're going to have a cooling off period. And the closed shop said, you've got to be a member of a union to work there. No, according to Taft-Hartley, doesn't happen anymore. And a lot of states, including North Carolina, passed right-to-work laws, which allow an employer to basically fire people for almost any reason. It's really strange when you have to do that. I've had to, in my role as a school administrator, I've had to let several people go, and it's no fun. Especially when they're good folks. And it's not too bad when they're not, but it's interesting. And so states are going to pass this so that business has that opportunity to get rid of folks who are not working out or agitators and things like that. And the question I've got, is it radical or reactionary? And that right there is reactionary. Boom, shifting over toward that right. When during the New Deal, we had shifted to the left somewhat. Is going to become a civil rights icon that nobody at the time gave him credit for. I mean, this picture in the oval here is Jackie Robinson of the Brooklyn Dodgers. I've been an LA Dodgers fan since I was a child because they were the Braves' arch enemy. And this year won the first World Series since 1988, since I was a senior in high school. And it's fantastic. Matter of fact, I think I need to get a Brooklyn hat. But the president is going to create something called the President's Committee on Civil Rights. This is a guy who had Confederate ancestors, who's from Missouri, about the most conservative of conservative states, and all of a sudden he's wanting to have civil rights. Folks, this is when you know a new era has dawned, and he's going to call for desegregation in society. And some of these conservatives at that time are looking at him like, what in the world? Things like anti-lynching legislation or end of poll tax or money you had to pay to vote. I mean, listen, today we're fussing because we can't vote early enough or blah, blah, blah. Back then you had to pay money to vote. In some places, a literacy test. The Alabama one, I used to have a copy of it. And as much as I have studied the American Constitution, I can't pass it. And that was the goal. So when Truman's calling for an end to this foolishness, we just fought a war against fascists who saw the Jews as some kind of subhuman or Untermenschen race. And now Truman's going, we're going to get rid of our crap here in America too. So you talk about a groundswell. World War II is the groundswell for civil rights. And so in 1948, here's what happens. Truman's like, you know what? I can't make you states do this, that, and other, but by God, I can desegregate the armed forces. And people are like, oh my God, it's going to ruin the American military, blah, blah. Guess what? Didn't. Made it even stronger. And in the later 40s, Jackie Robinson is going to integrate baseball. And people figure out, guess what? If you can play, it doesn't matter the color of your skin or whatever. It doesn't matter. And so we get to much more modern, look at this. And the question is that radical or reactionary? Well, I don't think it's really either. But in the sense of our political spectrum, it's moving toward radical. But I think there's a better word. And I think the better word here is progressive. And I don't mean those crazy progressives we dealt with for like the first 2 weeks class either. But it's progressive and moving in a much more modern direction. And so when we get to teach this era or talk about this era, it makes me quite happy. So then we need to look at succession. And what I mean by that is, presidential succession. Because now we have weapons. And by 1949, us and the Russians have the same thing that can quite literally decapitate a government in a tenth of a second. And so now, in case this nuclear and later thermonuclear, which means you just inject tritium into it and the whole thing goes boom, bigger, we need a way to succeed the presidency. Because what happens if the president and the vice president die? Well, now it goes to the Speaker of the House, which is Nancy Pelosi, which I think scares everybody in this country, except maybe Nancy Pelosi. Sometimes you get some real interesting characters in politics, but what it does, it goes president, vice president, Speaker of the House, president pro tem of the Senate, and it works itself all the way down the list, all the way to Virginia Fox, who is one of the representatives from my area. And if you live in Cleveland County, probably yours too. And that's going to be codified in the 22nd Amendment. Actually, that didn't codify in the 22nd Amendment. What in the world am I talking about? That's later. See, listen, you can't listen to me some days. But what we do have happen during that period of time is the 22nd Amendment. Lord, so I'm getting my amendments screwed up. But that 22nd one is what I like to call the anti-Roosevelt Amendment. And what happened is Roosevelt served one term, then two, then three, then started a fourth and then killed over dead down in Georgia. And so what they decided was that was way too long to be a president. So it's going to limit him to 2 full terms. Except it didn't include Harry Truman in it for whatever reason. So Truman could apparently have run for 20 terms had he wanted to. But, nowadays you have presidents like in my lifetime, Ronald Reagan. I grew up on Reagan, loved me some Reagan. He couldn't serve anymore. Or, some of you may have been bored during the Clinton years. And people loved him some old Bubba Bill Clinton. He's going to serve those 2 terms. Or more recently, Obama. I mean, Lord, that guy could keep on getting elected. Was young enough to do it. But not after this. Now they said, you know what? It's really not an elected kingship. And so after 2 full terms, you have to go. And the question is that liberal or is that conservative? And my thing is, I think it's a little bit of both. Because if it's your party that's in, you're good with it. If it's the other guy that's in, it sucks. So if you're a liberal or a conservative, you could get behind this as a way to keep government relatively honest. But in the meantime, yourself an early Red Scare. And remember back to World War I, and we were afraid of that spread of communism or Bolshevism or whatever we called it. Well, we're afraid of communism. All I can think of is Drill Sergeant Hartman in Full Metal Jacket. The free world will conquer communism. But anyway, nuclear war, communist infiltration, that new depression. I mean, Lord have mercy. If you're a politician, you're playing it. And the Smith Act is one of those things that happens where it's going to be illegal to advocate overthrowing the government. And when I first started teaching in the early '90s in North Carolina, there was a little Smith Act business in our contracts. What was the clause? It was a moral turpitude clause, and it dealt with overthrowing the government. I said, Lord, they're going to fire me tomorrow. But that idea is you're not going to have a communist. We're not going to be communist sympathizers. And in 1947, the House Un-American Activities Committee, with the fun police, they indict this guy named Alger Hiss, and you have to say it Hiss, because they say he's a Russian spy. And what happens is the HUAC begins to persecute the liberals, anybody in Hollywood they don't like, the New Dealers, anybody they think soft on communism or shows any kind of socialist tendency, they're going to persecute. And what happens is you end up getting on the list. And if you get on the list, you're not getting the job. And Truman, for all his good stuff with civil rights, is not real good with this because he gives the FBI under J. Edgar Hoover the authority to go after the Reds. And so they're going to look at 90 different disloyal organizations, and the Loyalty Review Board is going to investigate you. And especially if you're a federal employee, they're going to get a hold of you, and you're going to take a loyalty oath. And it's just it's almost like, there's fear that your politics better be right. I mean, we look at that today and laugh about it. Oh, so-and-so's of this supporter, so-and-so's of that supporter. And you kind of laugh about it and go on and make fun of people on Facebook. But back then, you could end up in front of the daggum Congress and end up potentially in jail or without a job. And so that's a little scary. And the question now, is that radical or reactionary? Oh, that's reactionary as can be. Okay? In the meantime, we're going to partition Palestine. Remember, we just got through a Holocaust that had perhaps as many as 10 million. I know the numbers vary. Perhaps as many as 10 million Jews and other, quote, undesirables that have been exterminated, as part of the Nazis' final solution. I really wish we had time to go into that because our understanding of the Holocaust is just a hair flawed. Not the Hitler and all his foolishness, but how it actually took place and how most people were actually killed. It was not in a gas chamber, I'll promise you. It was at the end of a rifle barrel. But that's a different story for a different day. So what's going to happen now is Palestine is the old home of the Jews. If you go back to the biblical days, Moses leading them from Pharaoh and into the promised land, it's the area of Palestine. And so what we decided is in the Atlantic Charter that we're going to dismantle all these little empires. It's time to be done with them. And the United Nations, which is going to meet just before the end of the war and begin its operations in San Francisco, sets up what they call a Commission on Refugees. And the biggest single grouping was European Jews as part of the diaspora when they get kicked out, way, way back, just after the time of Julius Caesar. Now they've been living in Europe for all of these hundreds of over 1,000 years. And so what are we going to do? Well, if I've just been persecuted like that, I'm not going home. And many did not want to go home. And there has been this idea of a Jewish homeland since the end of World War I. It's the Zionist, even before that, during the new imperial era. And so what happens? Jews decide, they're not waiting on the UN. They're not waiting on America. They're not waiting on Great Britain. They decide they're going to set up their own homeland in what was called Transjordan at the time. And so what the UN decides, we're going to create this mandate, and we're going to say, boom, here's you a country. And so the problem is now you've got a country, you're going to tick off a whole bunch of people in the Middle East. The Palestinians today seem to be a very victimhood-oriented group because prior to this time, right here with the creation of the State of Israel, they were treated as, in a lot of ways, as second-class citizens in the Middle East by other Middle Eastern and Arab groups. But now that here comes the crazy Europeans and the UN and America, the Great White Satan, has come in and created the nation of Israel. Now all of a sudden they're our little brothers again, which is the enemy of your enemy is your friend. But America and the Soviet Union are going to try to really fall all over themselves to recognize Israel, and America beats them to it. And the thing of it is, America had to do this because if Russia hadn't recognized them first, then Russia has all this undue influence in the Middle East, and there's something there that we all know we're going to need later, and it's oil. And so we've got to have that influence in that area. But in the meantime, what happens is a lot of these Arab states get incredibly mad at America, and they begin to attack Israel. And Israel defeats them. Israel always defeats them. Israel defeats them every time they have a war. But now there's some simmering anger, especially at Israel's big brother, America. And America's got these different federal laws passed that say we must support Israel and keep it have a significant military edge. I think it's called SME that we have to keep. So that's some of the origins of that. We might get to a little more of that later. But in the meantime, Harry Truman's got his own problems. He's got the 1948 election. Well, here's the Democrats, which he's part of. And then there's a group under Strom Thurmond, if any of you remember that crazy cat, out of South Carolina called the Dixiecrats. It's a splinter party, much like the Bull Moose. And so what you get is Truman, who's not nearly as conservative as people want him to be. He's trying to flesh out the New Deal. He said, we're going to call this a fair deal. And so you got Republicans around there going, you know what, we need to dismantle this foolishness. We need to dismantle this crazy communist-looking labor, and we need to act like we've got some sense in their terms. And so all this polling looked just like this last election, and the general consensus was that Dewey was going to beat Truman. Matter of fact, the Chicago newspaper there, famous picture, he's printed it the night before, Dewey defeats Truman. Well, guess what? He didn't. Truman's victory came about from all these different groups that were threatened by the Republicans and what they wanted to tear down, which in some ways is kind of like how the Joe Biden ticket has kind of won, or we think they've won, or what. Who knows at this point, but it looks like that's the case. So what we see playing out today, we've seen it all play out before everybody, and in some ways much more dramatically than the day. We just didn't have 24-hour news and the internet back then. What's Truman going to come up with? This fair deal. This is this addition to the New Deal. And look at what he does. Raises minimum wage. Maybe that's a good thing. Now, I got some friends that run a podcast called Words and Numbers. They'll tell you real quick that it's not a good thing, but we're not going to let James and Ant see this lecture. Public housing, extending Social Security. 65, I turned 50 on the 13th, and 65 is not that far away anymore. I thought 65 meant you were ancient and dead and dust coming out your nose. Now it's a little more vibrant these days. What happens is he didn't get to add a whole lot to the New Deal, but he did get to maintain it. And that's just as important, believe it or not, because what ends up happening, especially with the election of 52 in the rise of Dwight Eisenhower as president, who's going to serve 8 years, the New Deal becomes accepted by both parties. It's there. We're not going to take it away. So that becomes a thing, to use the parlance of the youth back when I was in the classroom teaching the last time. And so the last thing I want to leave you with here is the concept of the vital center. Another Twitter buddy named Bridget Fatassi, or I don't know how to pronounce her last name, got a shrill little voice, but as sharp as a tack. And so the day before the election, she gets on Twitter and her little podcast and all this other stuff she does, and she's hollering, "The center must hold, the center must hold." And all I can think of is this next slide, the vital center. And this is something that is not happening in American politics anymore, and it's very sad. So what happens? In the late 40s, you get a political census that kind of develops. Neither party is going to swing too far from the center, and each one of them there's like 3 components to this. And number one is anti-communism, because nobody wants to get painted with the communist brush. Number 2 is that if we can just get the economy to grow, some of these problems will go away. And there's truth in that, okay? If people making money, then problems just tend to go away. And the third one is this idea of political pluralism. And I think the anti-communism and political pluralism are gone in America. And there's a lot of question about how the economy should grow. It's really distressing when you see how wonderful this works for nearly 50 years. 40-something at the least. But this idea that a variety of ideas can compete in America. These days, if you don't agree with the other one, you're a Nazi, you're a commie, you're Joe Stalin, you're Adolf Hitler. It's god-awful. And nowhere is that legitimate. This concept of the vital center in America from 1946 through roughly 1992, this right here is what it's going to call some of the greatest economic and civilization advancement that we've ever seen. So anyway, just keep that in the back of your mind. And what happens is that center is going to carry elections through 64. It actually carries them through the 88 election in so many ways. Now, most historians will say 64. It just depends on the definition that they want to use. All right, well, we'll pick this up in a little bit on the beginnings of the Cold War. That's about 30 minutes of hearing me talk. That's about enough for anybody at one sitting. So anyway, we'll pick it up with the Cold War.